Excellent. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. So this is going to be a discussion where I'll be talking a bit about my experience developing policies for the Government of Canada and the kinds, like I always mentioned, the challenges and some of the unique opportunities. And hopefully we can have, I can take some questions and answers. So a bit about me. So I'm counsel. I've been I started my career at the Federal Department of Justice, worked there for just over 10 years, always very much at the intersection of data and the law, working on foundational legal opinions as departments were increasingly starting to leverage AI and the unique challenges that it brought, especially from our charter perspective as well as administrative law. And then I was asked to join the CIO of Canada to help develop policies, assessment tools, and basically toolkits that departments could use to leverage technology in a way that is responsible and can maintain that kind of confidence with Canadians. And I'll talk a bit about as well later. And I've since left government. It's been about a year and a half now that I've joined the private sector at Inc. Law, a Canadian law firm based out of Toronto, where I continue down this path, but really now I'm helping the private sector in their AI ambitions. So similar kinds of problems, but different kinds of ways to address the problem. And I also teach part-time at the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa. So this is essentially what I'm going to be talking about. I'll talk a bit about the foundations for AI policy. And again, I'll be very much speaking from the Canadian context, just to show our journey, and then maybe you could see what applies, what doesn't apply as the presentation moves on. And then I'll speak specifically about a policymaking process itself and the way that Canada went about to actually regulate AI. It was a different approach in the process. And then things about what and how can we actually go about this. And then I'm going to say my personal predictions and trends as to what I'm seeing both within governments and some of the trends in the private sector. So to start, when Canada started this journey, what really fueled the need for policy was really a trust deficit. And it became very clear that Canadians were very weary of the fact that the government wanted to increase its use of AI. It saw that it funded aggressively, and it was at the time when Canada invested in the Pan-Canadian AI strategy. So a lot of money went into research superclusters. It generated a lot of attention, and the government wanted to benefit from a lot of these investments. And quickly, we started seeing in the polls that it doesn't matter really what the government wanted to do. The polls constantly said that, government was probably going to make a mistake, and there was this persistent trust issue. So that's when the CIO of Canada, who is responsible to basically develop all the policies that apply to all departments in Canada, took on the mandate to set out what are the key policy suites that we would need to be able to show that Canada will be a leader in responsible AI and really do this in a proactive fashion. So that's the genesis of the need for the policy, and it comes to the point of needing to really ground why it is that you're starting this pursuit of policymaking. So we're seeing across the world there's different values underpinning that drive for policymaking. So in Canada, it was very much a rights base, right? We were very attuned to having like a human rights lens to our policies, administrative law, very heavy on the rights. But that's run across everywhere, right? So in the EU, for instance, there's much more like a greater appetite for risk-based thinking. So we're already seeing that they're looking at, providing different kinds of regulations based perhaps on the kinds of sectors that are going to be using AI. And in the U.S. also, it's been signaled like through the memorandums and other documents that you're all very familiar with, but just this idea of balancing, the benefits to the risks and having maybe a much more cost-benefit type analysis to the approach to regulation. So very much grounding it is the first step. So whether it comes to the strategies, virtues, principles, the underlying foundations for your policies is the first step, and then finding a way to get the buy-in with regards to those foundations. I also will talk a little bit about later, like the bureaucratic challenges. So in Canada, this came from the Treasury Board's Secretariat. As I was mentioning, this is where, the different kind of policy suites emanate. By design, there are some limitations as to what the TPS can regulate and not regulate. Like, for instance, we weren't able to create policies that applied to internal services because that triggered all kinds of other requirements from a policy suite perspective. So there's a lot of thinking that needs to go with what kind of approach is already possible with the policy instruments. There are a couple particularities that we did in Canada because we realized that there were important limitations in our approach. So we wanted to move away from a policy design that was the traditional, here's what we're suggesting, we take a pause, we go out to consultations, we generate a lot of feedback, a lot of comments, we bring those back, then we kind of have like the debrief of this is what we heard, and then go back. This was a very, very slow process, and we found that it just wouldn't get to the pace of actually rolling out something in a timely fashion that was really pressing, right? And in this case, it was the automated decision making systems that needed to have some guidance. So we wanted to see whether or not we can kind of create a way that still had the collaborative input seeking, but moving away from the bureaucratic gauntlet around what a consultation traditionally means in the policymaking process. So we decided to basically consult in real time as we were drafting. So we had the permission from senior management that we were going to do the first open policy making process in Canada. So essentially we were drafting the directive on automated decision making on a Google Docs that was perpetually open. We never closed it. So as we were working, like I would have sometimes in the upwards of 50 people watching me work. They would see in real time the kinds of thinking that we were doing. We were being able to get comments. And as we're developing this and we're seeing the kinds of comments, where we were also able to identify that core group of interested stakeholders that, really wanted to be involved in the process. And that became, like a shadow consultation team that we were able to go and speak to and invite and really leverage their inputs and their expertise. So the idea of open policymaking in the AI space, we thought was probably the one factor that led to the success that it had in Canada. We were able to get a lot of different inputs. Government has a lot of expertise for sure, and we were really glad with what we had within our government structure, but there's a lot of talent and a lot of views and a lot of input that's, wasn't in-house, and sometimes it's hard to find, but by writing in the open like this, it was incredible to see the kinds of interest and input that we had going forward. So that's one of the big takeaways. It does have challenges. I could speak maybe a little bit later to that. There are questions, like it's not easy to do, and in Canada specifically for considerations like bilingual requirements and things like that, there was a lot of challenges. So I don't know how much Canada would be comfortable in having open policy making by default for all their policy instruments, but I think for AI it's particularly important given the complexity and the need for multidisciplinary input in that approach. The other really important piece of this is not to look at the immediate problem, right, but really keep an eye as to like what's coming up, right, and so really focus on not the immediate. So as we're looking at automated decision system, we want to make sure that we can capture the kinds of nuances that we were seeing coming up, and so that's why sometimes you're kind of regulating for something that's not necessarily yet a problem, but you're trying to anticipate that. So there's a lot of forward thinking that needs to happen. And then the second most important after open by design, I think it's this idea of proactive and experimental. We knew in Canada that we weren't going to get it right immediately, right? It's a new space. There was no other real precedents to look at the time when we were drafting that policy. And we wanted to create a way in which within the very process that we had, like within the policy instruments, within the way that we were to revise the policies, that we could do this quickly. And how can we streamline what we call like the refresh cycles? Traditionally in Canada, policies are reviewed, I think, every 3 years, 3 to 5 years. That's kind of your default trigger. We wanted to have a refresh that was basically every 3 months, because once this thing happens, we know we're going to learn, we're going to realize that there's some false positives, right? Or missed some areas. So how can we quickly fix it without needing, that long, lengthy review, and also in terms of delegated authorities to approve the changes. So traditionally, those amendments need to happen at a very high level. So we made very strong arguments that there should be a new delegated authority on the directive that would be the CIO, so that the approvals to amend were that much faster. So I'm really happy to see that as well in the Canada's approach to AI, that refresh cycle and that ability to course correct as we learn, as things evolve, that doesn't stop, because it's a very hard space to regulate and it's changing very quickly, and you don't want to be in a position where you're just stuck and you're in the process of trying to amend something that might take years to change. Are there any questions on that, or maybe I should just continue and then we'll take questions at the end? It would be easier. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what is it that we're regulating, right? So this was, I would say, the lengthiest part of the process as we're trying to decide, like, are we regulating AI? Are we regulating, automated decision systems that solely make decisions, kind of like the GDPR approach, right, where it's only like an end-to-end approach to decision making? So we're really wrestling with this, and we came to the conclusion that you need to focus on the outcome, right, the kinds of problem that you're trying to solve. Like, for instance, this is the next one that we were starting to discuss, is like facial recognition, for instance, right, which is just a technology application. It's like, are we trying to regulate the facial recognition as a technology? Are we trying to regulate the use of facial recognition in a certain context, let's say policing? So really it's that long discussion of, let's focus on the outcome that we're trying to protect. And it's generally not about the technology. It's really based on the outcome that is now being accelerated, or the risk of some kind of harm is magnified by the use of an emerging technology. And so you'll see in Bill C-11 as well, in their definition of automated decision systems, this is very broad. We came to terms with, yes, if it is a simple linear regression or, code perhaps in an Excel spreadsheet that's being used to make a decision, then it should be captured within the ambit of our policy. So, which is contentious, and people are still discussing, the idea of that scope. But it's very much based on what's the problem that we're trying to solve, and sometimes you need to move away from the technology for a bit and then come back to it. But it's a very important discussion, and it generates a lot of different views because we're still in a space where, like I said, getting it right in the first pass is going to be very challenging. So it's about keeping that openness and ability to change as you're trying to really protect against the harm that you're mitigating against. Now, the next question is, how do you regulate, right? So in Canada, when we started, we thought that this policy that we're going to be making was actually going to be very low within our hierarchy of policy suites, right? We were thinking it was going to be a standard. And then as you go, you realize that based on the kinds of prescriptions that you're putting in there, that you might be upping the weight and the strength of obligation of your policy instrument. So keep that flexible because, again, it's back to the most efficient way to protect against the outcome. And sometimes that'll change as you're developing, and figuring out a way that this integrates with other existing suites. So like we, in the AI space, especially in Canada, one of the interrelationships that necessarily happen is, how does this relate with our existing kind of privacy impact assessment frameworks and our privacy legislations and our privacy policies? So AI really sits, it's like a new dimension around data use that we'll have to incorporate with a broader kind of data governance or data policy suites as well. So keep that in mind. It can't do all things, and you don't want that overlap to happen with the other existing instruments. So that's the integration. There's also a lot of discussion that happens around, is this just going to be a checklist, right? Like almost like a one-size-fits-all, where if you're doing an automated decision system, then here are all the things that need to happen. You need to be transparent. You need this level of explainability. And we're like, well, this doesn't really work, right? And we quickly realized that there's a lot of different automated systems that were in departments in Canada, ranging from, very simple, end-to-end micro-granting decision systems that could issue small amounts of checks, $1,000 here or there based on whether or not 6 categories have been hit, all the way to whether or not, people can enter or leave Canada and visa determination. So there was a wide scale of automated decision systems that were in use. And so we realized that the idea of just having a list of requirements that would apply to all decision systems would be problematic. And so we wanted to switch our lens to like, how can we create meaningful discussions around risk? How can we score, a system as riskier than another in a way that's measurable and demonstrable? And that's the genesis of the algorithmic impact assessment framework that was built in Canada, which is this way for departments to answer questions and based on, answer configurations, a specific risk level would happen, and based on that risk, then specific requirements would be generated. And this is like an online tool. We consulted broadly in the design of this, and it was a fascinating approach. Again, we leveraged open policymaking in this, and so we figured out a way to start giving risk levels to algorithmic systems, which was very welcomed by departments. And I think in a broader fashion within AI communities, I think we're increasingly seeing that openness to how do we create meaningful risk assessments for various types of AI systems across the globe. So that's it. So that's a discussion to have for sure. How much of this can be compliance? How much of this needs to be tailored to risk? And then the next one is how hard are the requirements going to be? So this was another very interesting discussion, and it's part of that policymaking process, is how prescriptive will you be in your policy requirements? So at first, should we specify the kinds of bias testing? Should we go into the level of detail into, the technical requirements that should come out from a data quality assessment? Or do we just want to let the departments figure out what's the best way to do data quality testing, for instance, right? So what's that balance? Like, we know the data quality testing, let's say, has to happen, but how prescriptive do you want to be is a very lively discussion. And where we ended up in Canada was in government, in the federal government, we wanted to, and it'll tie to my last point here, regulatory competition. We wanted to see how departments would respond, right? So if we said, like, it's level 3, there needs to be, let's say, robust data quality testing, and you leave it at that, and it's kind of intentionally a little bit vague. But then as departments are doing it, we can then go back, a Treasury Board authority or someone that has the oversight capacity, and say, like, how did you comply with robust data quality testing requirements? And then it's an opportunity to learn. And you're like, okay, this is what they did. And it's kind of feeding our thinking and say, okay, this is what's possible. This seems proportionate. What did they do? And as we're getting a sense of how departments are complying with a requirement, but that's still kind of loose or soft, it helps you to learn. And then once you're confident that you have enough information, then you can usually see how that can become a guideline or a clarification or perhaps an amendment going forward. So I think there's a value right now in this space. It's what I call regulatory competition, which is what's the best way to comply with perhaps a softer approach to compliance. I know we are moving to certification schemes. Like I'll speak a bit about that prediction later. I think certifications are the future. I just don't know if now is the appropriate time to be able to say with confidence that this is the hard requirement. I think it's still a very much an evolving fluid space, and the ability to show what's your best approach to comply or to deliver on those requirements is a great lesson learned. And that ties in with the role of regulators. So in Canada, they just proposed a Bill C-11, which is our new kind of PIPEDA, our Data Protections Act reform. And there's an increased openness for the privacy officer to receive from industry the kinds of advice and practices that are already in place, to get like a proactive, yes, you're complying. Like, this approach to managing your AI systems is sound, right? So in government, it's the same kind of approach that we've taken. Like, is there a way for TBS or the CIO of Canada to start proactively hearing what departments are doing and then already signal check that this is, the right path. Again, to this idea of feeding, the developers, the departments, the experts feeding into the policymakers so that there's a connection, right? Often, without that, you see policymakers making requirements that are often divorced from what's happening on the ground. So the more that you can have this kind of proactive discussion, proactive compliance, regulatory competition, I think it helps provide more meaningful policies and directions that will align with what's actually happening on the ground. So here are some of the trends and predictions that I see that apply, I think, both in government and in the private sector. But we're increasingly seeing that AI-related issues are becoming data governance issues. The discussion is quickly turning to how can we augment existing privacy frameworks to augment it to take on the new kinds of challenges that are happening with AI use, where, let's say, information doesn't have personal information, or we're using data in a way that has a greater impact, perhaps on people's choices and autonomy and the rest. So it starts with self-assessments, and and this applies as well with departments. It starts with the idea of how can departments measurably demonstrate what they're doing, and what's the best form to do that. And so it could be maybe like your community practice, right, or something like this, where we're encouraging, the self-assessment frameworks, the kinds of considerations that are going into AI, and really learn from it. And it's really important, especially in government and Canadian context anyway, to show those self-assessments to citizens, because I think that goes a long way. Just knowing that Canada undertook the algorithmic impact assessment framework, that they went through this policymaking in the open. We really did see a change in the kinds of that trust metric that I was talking about in the beginning. It definitely did alleviate a lot of the tensions, and we also saw it, in academia. There's a lot more written about that approach and how it just really helped curb what otherwise could have been, not a crisis, but it certainly chills the openness and willingness for departments to ultimately use technology that should benefit citizens. So self-assessments, 100%. And the more those are open, the better it is. The next step, and we haven't seen it yet, I'm waiting for it. The judicial and the courts have been fairly silent in this space still. And I think a lot of the important cases are getting settled outside of court for various reasons, but we're not getting a lot of guidance. I know that's going to happen. I was actually hoping it was going to happen sooner. But I'm predicting that what we're going to see with judicial interventions is the emergence of a standard of care for departments or industry that are using technology. So there needs to be some standard that can be assessed to assess whether or not it's been reasonable, or what is that standard. And failure to breach that standard would be like a claim in negligence or something like that. So I think that, and it dovetails nicely on the self-assessment. So you could see, the litigation following some kind of trend, like, this is my self-assessment. They would go to the courts would look at it and say, yeah, that was diligent. That seems to have met that reasonable or professional standard for the duty of care, so you're good. Or perhaps it fell short. So I think that self-assessment and what's already being done will be reviewed by the courts, and ultimately there'll be some pronouncement as to what is that standard that needs to be met. And then we will see regulations. Regulations are hard to do. It's very complex. I think it's going to start small. In Canada, the AI space, what's being signaled is automated decision-making. It's front and center. I'm not hearing a lot on facial recognition yet or other uses. I think the first ones we'll see in the next couple of years will be all about decision-making systems. But I mean, there's a lot more than just this, right? So even though it won't be regulated, we're still going to go back to this judicial self-assessment space for the other technologies. And then once it's been, tested, regulations are out, it's been amended, the court decisions have pronounced themselves on standards of care and things like this. I think that's where we'll start seeing certification marks. That's where we're going to see, IEEE and ISO requirements and things like that have now learned enough, seen enough, tested enough, it's known enough so that we can say with confidence that this is what's expected, let's say, every time we use the system that does decision making needs to have the following kinds of requirements. So that's kind of the art, and I still think that we're more in the self-assessment still, light regulations, and the judicial will happen imminently. Interesting, something to follow. And here are some examples of where I see some government policies that are future facing. I mean, I left government now for about a year and a half, but I know that these discussions are still there. But so the first and most important, I think, is to have an algorithmic impact assessment framework. How can we meaningfully speak about risk when we're talking about AI? Like, get that guesswork out. I've seen it 1,000 times. I'm sure you guys have too. You talk to your data scientist folks, and they say, "Oh, this isn't risky. This is just statistics. We've been doing this forever." And your business people are like, "I don't know. I've seen some articles in the Globe and Mail about this. It sounds risky." So, everyone has a different view of talking about risk. This needs to be standardized. So that discussion is very important. And once you have nailed that, you'll see that all your AI ambitions and all your builds can then be level set and accelerate a lot faster, because you're cutting off that whole confusion about who's accountable to set the risk. How do we talk about risk and the rest? So algorithmic impact assessments is 100% a critical aspect of responsible AI. And then we're going to see a lot of guidance on automated decision-making systems. Right now, Bill C-11 in Canada is still very early. There's not a lot of clarifications, but there's, signaling as to what's expected, but there's going to be a lot of work on guidelines as to what exactly is a decision system, what's that threshold, if a human makes the final call, does that mean the whole process isn't automated? Anyways, there's a lot of that spectrum as to how far is assist and how far is the solely deciding machine that needs to be fleshed out. And then everything that has to do with explainability and transparency, I think, is going to be probably 80% of the policy work in the next couple of years at least. And what is that? What is that meaningful explanation that needs to happen? So for instance, in Canada, the way that we approach that problem at first, but if it was a low-risk system, explainability could be as simple as a static explanation on a web page that explains at a high level the kinds of weights and considerations that go into an output, and that's your explanation, right? Or all the way up to higher-risk systems where, it might be required to have transactional explanations on each discrete outcome to an individual, when a decision is made. And once we hit that, then the question is, what is a meaningful explanation? Does a counterfactual approach suffice, right? Or do we need to, anyways, it just gets very complicated very quickly, but it's very important, especially in the context of administrative law, when, there are some due process considerations that need to happen when citizens are getting, benefits, let's say, decided with using an automated decision system. Same thing with transparency. A lot of discussion on that. What's meaningful transparency? Just putting up source code. Is that really useful? Does that really mean anything? When is that the right thing to do? We spoke about data escrows within the context of the AIA. If there were significant trade secrets that need to be protected, could we put on high-risk systems, for instance, a data escrow where all the source code would be there, and with an approved list of people from the outside that they can then come in and interrogate it and test it if needed. So you could see that that's a very interesting policy-making area that I think is going to be trending importantly in the next couple of years. And then also everything that has to do with de-identified data. So in Canada, we're still in this vacuum. Once data has been de-identified, it's like, there's no personal information, so nothing applies to me. I can do whatever I want with my data. And the problem with that is things like the Toronto Smart City, where the whole initiative just falls because we realize that we don't really know what to do with the identified data, and just saying that there's no personal information, we can do whatever we want, just doesn't cut it. So I think that's another one that citizens are demanding more rigor around what's the expected use when data is de-identified, and what's expected. So I think we'll see policies on that. The other one here, and this is an important piece, that I should have spoken to probably earlier on. But in Canada, our approach to AI policy was basically three. There's three big prongs, right? Like first, invest in superclusters, invest in the talent in Canada, and then get policies and frameworks in place to show that we can do this right, like that responsible innovation. And then the third piece is how can the government actually procure it and leverage the kinds of investments that have been made. And again, to the point of clunky processes and systems, technology procurement in Canada was notoriously slow and inefficient, especially in the AI environment, where there were some unique kind of configurations, the way that, a lot of the solutions that Canada wanted to buy weren't COTS, right? Weren't commercially available, just off-the-shelf products, and most of our technology procurement vehicles were for COTS, and it became very clunky. So the third priority that I was involved in Canada was develop a new way for governments to acquire AI services, products, and solutions. So we developed an AI source list, which was amazing. It was basically cut the procurement time by, I think, 15, 16 months. We were able to get, some vendors within departments within 4 months. So I could talk a little about that. There's interest as to the way that happened. There's still lessons learned on that. It wasn't 100%. But again, we needed to do something and course correct and learn. Again, I put in refresh mechanisms in our procurement vehicle as well, for the same reasons that we discussed, that it's hard to get this right on the first pass, and you don't want to get stuck with a mistake that's difficult to change. And then the final policy one that I think we're going to be seeing, and I'm seeing this a lot in industry. I'm not hearing it a lot yet on the government side, but I think it's going to get there. But it's the same kind of approach of what is the required quality of data sets do you need when you're rolling out certain sets of AI systems, and what does that mean, and how can you create a more standardized and consistent way of testing and reporting on your data sets. So like, what are some of the key performance indicators that you need? What are the data quality standards that should apply, right? There are a lot out there, but nothing's really that recognized authority around data quality testing. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there to just talk about what is sound and defensible data testing processes and practices. So those are some of the policies that I see coming up. And there's more, of course, but I think those are my top 5 or top 6 there that I put in. So that's essentially what I wanted to say. I can, take questions, go back for a deeper dive on different areas, but I'm open now to just open up to the floor and see.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording at this time.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. All right. So if you have a question, put something in chat